I am Kaylee. I am 36, and 2 weeks after we buried my father, my younger sister sat in a mahogany-paneled law office and tried to erase my children from our family tree. She slid a thick, bound document across the polished table, smiled at me, and announced that my 4-year-old adopted twins were not real family. Then she said she would be petitioning the court to strip Leo and Maya of their inheritance because they did not possess the proper bloodline. Every eye in that Hartford probate office shifted to me at the exact same time. I picked up my fountain pen, pressed the cap onto it with a sharp click, and said, "Oh, I see." What I did after that took a few weeks, and it started the second I walked out of that building, because the quiet sister they were all watching was not the one who had walked into a trap. My father had seen this coming long before I ever did. Welcome back to Pawn of Vengeance. These are quiet, true-to-life tales about ordinary women who keep their composure when family turns on them, and who win by knowing exactly what they are worth. How old are you, and have you ever had someone mistake your silence for weakness? Drop your age and your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe. 2 weeks before that meeting, I stood in the front row of a graveside service and kept the schedule running on time, because that is what I do. I am a forensic actuary. I have spent 12 years measuring risk, tracing hidden numbers, and building models out of human unpredictability. When numbers do not add up, people hire me to find the bottom line. I live in a world of rigid math and quiet logic. My family, however, lives in a world of loud, theatrical demands. So I greeted the distant relatives. I handed out tissues to people who had not spoken to my father in a decade. I kept my own grief tucked away in a neat compartment while I held my children's hands. My father, Richard, was a quiet man. He passed away on a Sunday evening from a stroke that offered no warning and no long goodbyes. We lived a town over here in Connecticut, and I spent the days following his death managing the funeral arrangements while my mother, Patricia, and my younger sister, Jessica, managed the grieving process. That meant they received the casseroles and the condolences while I signed the checks. I did not mind. I prefer the paperwork. Papers do not change their story depending on who is in the room. The reading of the will took place on a rainy Tuesday morning. The office smelled of old paper and lemon furniture polish. The attorney, a man named Sterling, who had taken over my father's estate file only a year prior, sat at the head of the long table. My mother sat next to him, her hands folded tight in her lap. Jessica sat across from me, her posture rigid, her designer trench coat draped carefully over the back of her chair. Sterling cleared his throat and read through the standard distributions. The house, the life insurance, the primary trust. The numbers hovered around $1.2 million. Then he reached the addendum, the codicil my father had added 4 years ago, the week the adoption papers for Leo and Maya cleared the state courts. The language was plain. It explicitly named my twins as equal beneficiaries alongside me, Jessica, and Jessica's biological daughter, Harper. Before Sterling could finish reading the paragraph, Jessica placed her hand flat on the table. "We are filing a formal challenge to that codicil," she said. Her voice carried the practiced, steady rhythm of someone who had rehearsed the sentence in her bathroom mirror. Sterling paused, lowering the document. Jessica did not look at him. She looked directly at me. She reached into her leather tote and produced a thick stack of legal filings, sliding them across the dark wood. She leaned forward. She cited a dusty provision from our grandfather's original trust documents, a clause drafted nearly a century ago that dictated inheritance must flow only to biological issue. "They are not blood, Kaylee," Jessica said. Her tone adopted that soft, pitying edge that makes you want to break glass. "It is tragic, I know, but they are a charity project. Dad was just being polite. The trust was meant for the true bloodline. Harper and I are the only real descendants left." The air in the room grew stale. I looked at my mother. Patricia kept her gaze fixed firmly on her own knuckles. She did not speak. In my family, Patricia's silence is never neutral. It is an endorsement. She had known Jessica was going to do this, and she had chosen to sit back and watch. Jessica tapped her manicured fingernails against the table. She wanted a scene. She expected me to cry, to raise my voice, to defend my children's worth right there in front of a stranger in a suit. She wanted me to give her a reaction she could point to later as proof of my instability. That is the tactic they always used. Poke the quiet one until she snaps, then blame her for the noise. I looked at the legal challenge resting near my coffee cup. I looked at my sister's expectant, hungry face. I felt the steady, familiar rhythm of my own pulse. I reached into my bag, pulled out my planner, and closed it. I picked up my fountain pen. I pressed the cap on. It made a single, sharp sound in the quiet room. "Oh, I see," I said. I stood up, slid my arms into my coat, and picked up my purse. I did not slam the chair. I did not offer a defense of my children, because my children do not require a defense to exist. "Where are you going?" Jessica asked, her rehearsed confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. "We are not done here." I walked to the heavy oak door, turned the brass handle, and stepped out into the hallway. I walked to my car under the gray autumn sky, the cold air hitting my face. I sat in the driver's seat and placed my hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Jessica thought she was brilliant. She thought she had found a legal loophole to double her inheritance and strip my family down to the studs. But she had just declared a war without checking her ammunition. She had demanded a fight based entirely on genetics, and she had no idea what was actually resting in my father's private files. The house on Elm Street was quiet at 6 in the morning. I sat at my kitchen island with a mug of dark roast warming my palms. The granite counter felt cold against my forearms. Down the hall, my 4-year-old twins, Leo and Maya, were still asleep. Their soft, rhythmic breathing was the only metric I cared about at that hour. I had spent the previous night reviewing the paperwork from the probate office. I prefer to read legal documents when the sun is down. The darkness offers a quiet environment, allowing the mind to process the fine print without the interference of daily distractions. As a forensic actuary, I look for discrepancies. I look for the hidden risks buried beneath standard clauses. At exactly 7:15, my cell phone lit up on the counter. The screen displayed my mother's name. Patricia does not call before 8 unless she has spent the entire night formulating a strategy. I let the phone vibrate 3 times. Answering on the first ring signals anxiety. Answering on the fourth signals avoidance. The third ring projects a steady, unbothered availability. I slid the green icon across the glass and lifted the device to my ear. "Kaylee, sweetie," she purred. Her voice dripped with a specific honeyed cadence she only deploys when she needs me to shrink. It is a tone meticulously crafted to make the listener feel small, unreasonable, and deeply indebted. It is the velvet glove hiding the iron fist. "I know yesterday was tense," Patricia continued. The faint sound of a silver spoon clinking against a porcelain teacup echoed through the receiver. "Jessica is just emotional right now. She has always felt things so deeply. You know how she gets." I took a slow sip of my coffee. Jessica did not feel things deeply. Jessica felt things loudly. There is a vast difference between depth of emotion and sheer volume. Whenever my sister wanted something she could not earn, she simply increased her decibel level until the rest of us surrendered just to buy some peace. "But she does have a point about the bloodline," Patricia said. She lowered her volume as if we were sharing a sacred, ancient secret. "You know how proud your father was of our heritage? The Collins lineage meant the world to him. Jessica even inherited those famous Collins blue eyes. It is only right that the legacy stays pure." I rested my gaze on the stainless steel refrigerator. I thought about those famous blue eyes. It was a family myth we had all been forced to swallow for 3 decades. My father, Richard, had hazel eyes. They were a muddy, shifting green that turned the color of dried leaves in the summer sun. Neither of his parents possessed blue eyes either. Yet from the moment Jessica was born, Patricia had spun an elaborate fable about a recessive Collins gene skipping a generation. Everyone indulged her narrative because challenging Patricia on her maternal lore was a guaranteed path to a month of silent treatment. The blue eyes were a cornerstone of my mother's reality, and we were all expected to live inside it. "Just step aside," my mother urged. Her voice adopted the soothing, hypnotic rhythm of a hostage negotiator trying to coax a jumper off a ledge. "Surrender the codicil. Let the trust pass to Jessica and Harper. You have a great career. You make good money. You can provide for your two. But Harper is Richard's true granddaughter. Do this for the family, Kaylee. Be the bigger person." I did not answer immediately. I looked at the surface of the refrigerator. It was covered in uneven, vibrant finger paintings, a lopsided yellow sun hanging over a crooked green meadow, a stick figure with purple hair holding a red balloon. Maya had drawn a picture of our house last week, rendering the front door enormous and welcoming. Leo had added a smiling green dog sitting on the roof. These were the artifacts of my reality. My children were not abstract concepts. They were not charity projects to be tolerated at Thanksgiving dinners. They were the center of my gravity. They were the reason I worked 50-hour weeks, the reason I bought this house, the reason I paid life insurance premiums. The phrase for the family hung in the air between us. In Patricia's dictionary, the family was an exclusive club designed to cater solely to Jessica's whims. I was expected to act as the perennial shock absorber, the one who took the financial and emotional hits, so my younger sister never had to experience a moment of discomfort. "No," I said. The single syllable stopped the conversation cold. The clinking of the silver spoon on the other end of the line ceased. The silence that followed was thick, pregnant with the sudden realization that the usual script had failed. In the past, when Patricia applied this specific brand of pressure, I would negotiate. I would find a compromise to absorb the friction and maintain our holiday dinner schedule. I would bend. "Excuse me," Patricia said. The honey evaporated from her vocal cords, leaving a dry, rasping tone behind. I said, "No, Mom, I am not stepping aside. Dad wrote that codicil for a reason. He considered Leo and Maya his grandchildren long before he passed. I am honoring his final wishes. I am not giving up what belongs to them." The line went frigid. I could hear her breathing short and shallow. The mask slipped entirely, revealing the jagged, desperate edges underneath. She realized the guilt trip was ineffective. She had to resort to the heaviest weapon in her arsenal. "You are tearing this family apart over children who are not even yours," she snapped. The words were designed to gut me. They were meant to strike the deepest insecurity a mother can harbor, to invalidate my entire existence as a parent. But the blow did not land. I did not shed a tear. I did not feel my throat tighten or my hands shake. Instead, a profound, chilling clarity washed over my mind. "Have a good morning, Patricia," I said. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button to end the call. The soft click of the receiver was the sound of a boundary being drawn in concrete. The emotional extortion had failed. My mother had played her best card, attempting to leverage my empathy against my own children. She thought the threat of being cast out of the family circle would force me to fold the hand. But I am an actuary. When the emotional variables are removed from an equation, the math becomes incredibly simple to read. They wanted to measure my children's worth in arbitrary drops of blood. They wanted to invalidate my family using archaic rules of genetics to line their own pockets. I set my coffee mug in the sink and listened to the sound of Leo's footsteps padding down the hallway. He was awake, clutching his stuffed bear, rubbing his sleepy eyes. I smiled at him, feeling the warmth return to my chest. If my mother and sister wanted to play games with legal definitions and biological purity, I was perfectly willing to play with cold, hard facts. I knew my mother's behavioral patterns. I knew Jessica's entitlement. A polite refusal on a Tuesday morning would not end this dispute. The phone call was merely a courtesy warning, a chance for me to surrender before the real artillery was wheeled out onto the battlefield. By hanging up the phone, I had forced their hand. They would not hesitate now. They would seek to destroy my credibility, drain my resources, and threaten my peace of mind. I dried my hands on a cotton dish towel, calculating their next logical move. I waited for the inevitable knock on my front door, certain that the next envelope they delivered would not come wrapped in a sweet tone of voice. 72 hours passed without a single text or email from my mother or my sister. In my line of work, a sudden drop in communication never signals a peaceful resolution. It is the quiet period right before a statistical anomaly strikes. I understood they were building a response to my refusal. I just did not know what physical form that response would take until a Thursday afternoon in a Stamford grocery store. I had taken the afternoon off to restock the house. The twins needed fresh fruit, and I needed the mundane comfort of a routine task. The supermarket was bright humming with the low sound of refrigeration units and the faint chime of register scanners. I stood in the produce aisle inspecting a plastic container of strawberries. The air was cool against my face. I was deciding between two different packages when a man in a beige windbreaker stepped into my peripheral vision. He did not look like a shopper. He carried no basket and pushed no cart. He held a thick manila envelope against his side. "Kaylee Collins," he said. It was not a question, it was a verification. I turned to face him, the plastic container of strawberries still resting in my hand. "Yes, that is me." He extended his arm, pressing the envelope toward my chest, until I had no choice but to take it with my free hand. "You have been served," he murmured, turning on his heel and walking swiftly toward the automatic sliding doors. I stood under the fluorescent lights, the rough paper of the envelope scratching against my palm. A few shoppers glanced in my direction, their eyes wide with mild curiosity, before returning to their groceries. I set the strawberries back onto the chilled display shelf. The mundane comfort of the afternoon evaporated. I walked out of the store, my cart abandoned in the aisle, and headed straight for my vehicle. The autumn air had turned sharp and biting. I unlocked my SUV, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors before turning on the engine. The interior of the car felt like a sanctuary. I rested the manila envelope on the steering wheel and peeled back the metal clasp. I pulled out a stack of dense, stapled pages. The letterhead belonged to a boutique litigation firm in Greenwich, a practice notorious for bleeding family estates dry through endless procedural motions. Jessica had hired a bulldog attorney named Harrison Caldwell. He was an expensive, ruthless litigator who specialized in breaking people down through sheer financial attrition. I read the title of the filing, Petition to Invalidate the Codicil. My eyes tracked down the page, scanning the formal legal jargon. Caldwell had not just filed a standard dispute. He had drafted a surgical strike aimed directly at the legitimacy of my family. The document strictly defined my father's use of the word descendants as unbroken biological offspring. The petition argued that my father had been of diminished capacity when he signed the addendum 4 years ago, suggesting he had been unduly influenced by my constant presence to include non-blood relatives in a legacy meant for true heirs. The language was clinical, yet the intent was highly personal. Jessica was asking a probate judge to legally declare that Leo and Maya held no rightful place in the Collins lineage. It was a calculated move to induce panic. She assumed I would read those words, envision a brutal 2-year court battle, and beg for a settlement just to spare my children the public humiliation. I turned to the third page. Beneath the primary claims regarding the trust funds, there was an addendum for specific personal property. Jessica had included a demand for my father's vintage 1978 Rolex Oyster Perpetual. The paragraph claimed the watch possessed profound ancestral significance and rightfully belonged to the true bloodline, meaning her daughter Harper. I traced my finger over the black ink. The audacity of that specific request crystallized her entire motive. My father had worn that watch every single day. He wore it while attending board meetings, and he wore it while replacing the wooden planks on our back deck. The silver bezel was scratched, and the glass face bore a tiny chip near the 6 o'clock mark. It was a quiet, enduring object. Jessica did not care about the sentimental value of a scratched timepiece. She cared about the monetary appraisal and the status it projected. She wanted to strip every remaining piece of my father from my possession, leaving me with nothing but the memories she could not legally confiscate. Most people holding that petition would have felt their chest tighten. They would have pictured their savings account draining into a lawyer's retainer. They would have panicked at the mountain of aggressive paperwork. But Jessica did not understand how an actuary processes a threat. I do not panic at legal filings. I audit the fine print. I look for the foundational premise upon which the entire argument rests, and I test it for structural weaknesses. I read the second page again. I read the third page again. I focused on the specific phrasing Caldwell had chosen to employ: unbroken biological offspring, genetic lineage, true bloodline. Jessica had anchored her entire petition, her entire legal standing, on one highly specific pillar. She was betting everything on the assumption that a strict biological audit would secure her inheritance and eliminate mine. She was demanding the court draw a hard, impenetrable line based on DNA. A cold, distinct clarity settled over my mind. Jessica thought she had backed me into a corner. In reality, she had just submitted a permanent, sworn document into the public record that established strict biological adherence as the only valid metric for inheriting Richard Collins's money. She had dug a trench and dared me to cross it. She did not realize she had just constructed the very trap that would eventually swallow her whole. I aligned the corners of the thick legal document, tapping them against the steering wheel to make them neat. I slid the petition back into the manila envelope and folded the clasp down. I leaned over the center console and placed the envelope on the passenger seat. I reached for the seatbelt, pulled the nylon strap across the thick paper, and clicked the metal buckle into place. I secured it like a fragile glass sculpture. The evidence was too valuable to toss into the passenger footwell. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. The drive back to my house was enveloped in profound silence. I kept the radio off. The rhythmic thumping of the tires over the highway seams provided the only soundtrack I needed. I watched the Connecticut landscape blur past my window, the vibrant autumn leaves providing a stark contrast to the sterile legal battle brewing in my passenger seat. The legal machinery was officially moving. The clock had started ticking. I needed to respond, but I could not use the attorney who had read the will. Sterling was too closely tied to my mother's social circle. Patricia played tennis with his wife. She would leverage those country club connections to subtly influence the proceedings, ensuring Sterling remained compliant with her version of reality. I needed an estate lawyer who was entirely insulated from Patricia's reach. I needed a professional who understood the specific weight of the secrets my father kept locked away. As I turned onto my street and pulled into my driveway, my mind flipped through the mental Rolodex of my father's past associates. I thought of a man who had notably abstained from attending the initial will reading, a man who possessed the exact type of quiet lethality required for the impending war. I unbuckled the envelope, carried it into my house, and set it on the kitchen island. I knew exactly who I was going to call the following morning. I canceled my morning meetings the next day and drove straight toward downtown Hartford. I did not call ahead to make an appointment. In situations involving sudden legal threats, waiting for a scheduled slot surrenders the momentum to the opposition. I parked my vehicle in a narrow garage off Pearl Street and walked 2 blocks through the crisp morning air. The wind carried the scent of roasted coffee from a nearby corner cafe and the sharp tang of exhaust fumes. My destination was a weathered brick building housing the law practice of Greg Halloran. Greg had served as my father's personal attorney for over 2 decades. He was a quiet, deliberate man who operated far outside the flashy country club circles my mother preferred. When my father passed, Patricia had immediately steered the estate handling towards Sterling, citing Greg's impending retirement and claiming Sterling possessed a more modern touch. I now understood her pivot had nothing to do with modernization. Patricia wanted a lawyer she could manipulate through social leverage. Greg Halloran was a man who played golf alone and owed favors to no one. He had notably abstained from attending the initial will reading, a detail that struck me as odd at the time, but now felt like a glaring beacon. I pushed open the heavy glass door of his firm. The reception area was Spartan, featuring dark green leather chairs and a solitary receptionist who recognized my face the moment I stepped inside. She offered a brief knowing nod and led me straight back to his corner office without asking a single question. Greg sat behind a vast walnut desk. The surface was perfectly clear. There were no scattered files, no framed photographs turned outward for visitors to admire, and no decorative paperweights. The absence of clutter mirrored my own professional habits. An actuary appreciates an environment stripped of unnecessary variables. Greg looked up, his silver hair neatly combed, his expression giving away nothing. He gestured toward one of the armchairs opposite him. I sat down and withdrew the manila parcel from my bag. I slid Jessica's petition across the smooth wood. Greg pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, unfolded the wire frames, and slipped them onto his face. He picked up the filing. The room settled into a heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a brass grandfather clock standing in the corner. I watched his eyes scan the paragraphs. He read the aggressive definitions of biological offspring. He read the demands to strip Leo and Maya of their inheritance. He read the petty, vindictive claim regarding the vintage Rolex. I waited for a reaction. A sigh, a shake of the head, a raised eyebrow. Greg offered none of those. His facial muscles remained entirely relaxed. He reached the final page, aligned the edges of the paper with methodical care, and set the document back onto his desk. He took off his glasses and folded them flat. He did not gasp. He did not express outrage on my behalf. Instead, he reached down to the bottom right drawer of his desk. I heard the distinct metallic click of a key turning in a lock. He pulled the drawer open. The smooth glide of the metal tracks filled the quiet room. He reached inside and extracted a sealed, cream-colored envelope. The parchment was thick, the edges crisp and pristine. He rested it on the green leather blotter, sitting precisely in the center of his workspace. My gaze locked onto the familiar slanted cursive written across the front in dark blue ink. It was my father's handwriting. My name was spelled out in his careful, deliberate script. A tight knot formed in the base of my throat. The sight of that blue ink felt like a physical touch, a sudden tether reaching across the void of his death. "Your father handed this to me 4 years ago," Greg said. His voice was soft, carrying the gravelly texture of a man who speaks only when necessary. It was the Tuesday following the final court hearing for the twins' adoption. He walked into this office, sat in the exact chair you are occupying right now, and placed this envelope on my desk. I stared at the thick parchment. 4 years ago. That meant Richard had harbored a defensive strategy long before his health ever began to decline. He gave me very specific instructions, Greg continued. He told me to file it deep in his private archives. Then he leaned forward and said, "When Patricia and Jessica try to cut Kaylee's kids out, give her this." The words echoed off the wood-paneled walls. I felt the air leave my lungs. My father had seen this exact betrayal looming on the horizon. He knew the true nature of his wife and his youngest daughter. He understood that Patricia's obsession with her fabricated lineage and Jessica's bottomless entitlement would eventually converge into a weapon aimed directly at my children. While I had spent years attempting to absorb the friction and keep the holiday dinners peaceful, my father had recognized the futility of appeasement. He knew a storm was coming, and he had quietly constructed a storm shelter for me to use when the rain began to fall. I reached my hand across the desk, my fingers trembling slightly. For the first time since this ordeal began, I wanted to tear the flap open. I needed to see what final shield he had forged. Before my fingertips could brush the paper, Greg placed his own broad hand over the envelope. His palm covered my father's writing. "Do not open it yet," he advised. I looked up, meeting his steady gaze. His eyes gleamed with a quiet professional lethality. It was the look of a seasoned litigator standing 3 steps ahead of the opposing counsel. "Why?" I asked. My voice sounded thin, stripped of its usual objective armor. "Because timing is the singular difference between a skirmish and a checkmate," Greg replied. He tapped his index finger against the hidden parchment. "Jessica has fired the first shot, but the ink on her legal strategy is still wet. If you deploy this information too early, her attorney will pivot. Caldwell is ruthless, but he is also pragmatic. If you show your hand now, they will amend their filing, change their argument, and find a different avenue to attack your trust shares. He lifted his hand, allowing me to take the envelope, but his eyes never left mine. Let her lock herself into her legal argument first, Greg instructed. Let her stand before a judge and insist on strict biological adherence. Let her weave the rope tight. Let her insist on blood. When she has built her entire case upon that specific foundation and there is no room left for her to retreat, then you open this envelope. The logic was flawless. As an actuary, I understand the value of letting a flawed mathematical model run its course until the errors compound into a catastrophic failure. Greg was not suggesting we retreat. He was suggesting we wait for the enemy to march fully into the valley before detonating the ridge. I picked up the cream envelope. The paper felt heavy, carrying the weight of decades of guarded secrets. I slipped it into the inner zippered pocket of my purse, pressing it flat against the lining. I thanked Greg, stood from the leather chair, and left the quiet sanctuary of his office. I drove back to my house in Connecticut. The midday sun threw long shadows across my driveway. I walked into my kitchen, unzipped my purse, and withdrew my father's final piece of correspondence. I set it down on the granite counter, right next to a small ceramic salt shaker. I positioned it perfectly parallel to the edge of the stone surface. It required a monumental amount of discipline to leave the seal unbroken. Every instinct urged me to tear the paper and arm myself immediately. But I trusted my father, and I trusted the lawyer he had chosen to protect his legacy. I let the anticipation act as an anchor, a steady weight holding me firmly to the ground while the family storm prepared to unleash its fury outside. I poured myself a fresh glass of water. Before I could take a single sip, my cell phone began to vibrate against the counter. The screen illuminated, displaying a text message from a cousin I rarely spoke to. It contained a single screenshot and a brief, alarming caption. I set my glass down. The legal battlefield was quiet for the moment, but my sister had grown impatient waiting for my surrender. She was moving the war into the public square. The text message resting on my phone screen contained a single thumbnail image and a brief sentence from my cousin Sarah. The message read, "You need to look at this right now." I picked up the device. The glass felt warm against my palm. I tapped the image to expand it. It was a screenshot of a Facebook post. The author was my younger sister. Jessica has always treated her life like a stage production. During her teenage years, she thrived in local theater, and she never quite relinquished the habit of playing to the back row. If she experienced a minor inconvenience, it required an audience. If she felt wronged, it required a choir of sympathetic voices. Her digital footprint was a carefully curated exhibition of her own perceived perfection and perpetual victimhood. The post Sarah sent me was a masterpiece of manufactured tragedy. The image attached to the text was a candid photograph of her daughter Harper looking forlornly out a living room window. The lighting was muted, filtered, to emphasize a specific cinematic sadness. Below the photo was a sprawling, multi-paragraph essay. I read the words slowly, analyzing the syntax. Jessica did not use my name. She did not have to. She wrote about the grief of losing our father. She described the deep ancestral roots of the Collins family and the sacred bond of shared biology. Then the tone shifted. She detailed the heartbreak of watching an entitled family member attempt to steal her child's rightful legacy. The sharpest blade was hidden in the third paragraph. She claimed this unnamed relative was manipulating the legal system, using strangers' children to siphon resources away from Richard Collins's true biological granddaughter. Strangers' children. My chest tightened. The phrase was a physical blow aimed directly at Leo and Maya. My twins were not strangers. My father had rocked them to sleep. He had pushed them on the swings in the park. He had kept their framed preschool portraits on his office desk. Jessica knew this. She knew the depth of my father's love for them. But reality did not serve her current narrative. She needed a villain, and she needed an injured party. I scrolled down to read the comments section captured in the screenshot. It was a toxic echo chamber. Distant relatives, neighbors, and high school acquaintances had flooded the post with heart emojis and praying hands. My Aunt Helen from Ohio had typed the lengthy response preaching about the sanctity of lineage. She ended her comment with the tired cliché, "Blood is thicker than water." I stared at that specific phrase. People quote that proverb constantly when defending toxic family behavior, rarely realizing they are misquoting the original text. The actual ancient proverb is, "The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb." It means the bonds you choose to make are far stronger than the genetic ties you simply inherit. It is a defense of chosen family, of adoption, of conscious love. It means the exact opposite of what Aunt Helen intended. My thumbs hovered over the digital keyboard on my phone screen. The maternal instinct is a roaring fire. Every fiber of my being wanted to open the application, navigate to her profile, and type a devastating rebuttal. I wanted to list the times my father had ignored Jessica's calls because she only reached out when she needed money. I wanted to defend Leo and Maya's right to exist in our family. I wanted to burn her pristine digital stage to the ground. That was exactly what Jessica anticipated. It was a calculated trap. She had baited a hook and dropped it into public waters. If I defended my children in that comment section, I would legitimize her narrative. I would become the hysterical, defensive relative she described in her post. I would provide her with dozens of aggressive quotes she could print out and hand to her bulldog attorney. In a probate dispute, emotional online outbursts are lethal. They paint a portrait of instability. I lowered my thumbs. I closed the messaging application. I set the phone down on the granite counter next to the sealed cream envelope. I walked over to the coffee maker, pulled a fresh filter from the cabinet, and scooped in the dark grounds. The mechanical process grounded me. I poured water into the reservoir and pressed the brewing button. The machine hissed and sputtered, filling the kitchen with the rich, bitter scent of roasted beans. I walked back to my phone. I did not type a single defensive word. I did not block Jessica's profile, nor did I block Aunt Helen or any of the sympathetic neighbors. Instead, I opened my laptop and navigated to the social media platform. I found the original post. I used the keyboard shortcuts to capture the screen. I made sure the system clock in the corner of my monitor was clearly visible in every frame. I captured the main essay. I scrolled down and captured every single comment, every like, and every digital interaction. I opened a new encrypted folder on my hard drive. I titled it Probate Evidence. I dragged the high-resolution image files into the secure directory. My silence was a deliberate, tactical choice. As a risk analyst, I know that when an opponent is fighting with noise, the most effective countermeasure is a vacuum. The refusal to engage infuriates a narcissist far more than any screaming match ever could. Jessica was feeding off the drama. She needed me to provide the friction that kept her engine running. By offering nothing, I was starving her of the very attention she required to validate her actions. Furthermore, her decision to take the dispute public provided me with invaluable insight. Her attorney, Harrison Caldwell, was a seasoned litigator. A professional of his caliber would never authorize a client to post details of an active probate battle on a public forum. It complicates the legal proceedings and damages the client's credibility. This meant Jessica had acted impulsively. She had gone rogue. People holding a winning hand do not flip the card table. They sit quietly and wait for the dealer to distribute the chips. Jessica was broadcasting her victimhood to hundreds of acquaintances because she lacked confidence in her legal standing. The louder and more public her tantrums became, the more I understood she was desperately trying to mask a deep, hidden panic. She needed the validation of her peers because the facts were not enough to sustain her confidence. I poured my coffee into a ceramic mug and watched the steam rise toward the ceiling. I was building an impenetrable fortress of documentation. Let her have the emojis. Let her have the shallow sympathy of distant cousins. I would keep the time-stamped evidence. The digital smear campaign ran its course over the weekend. My phone remained silent. I did not react. I took the twins to the park, I read them stories, and I slept a full 8 hours each night. My lack of participation was a brick wall her drama could not penetrate. By Monday morning, the realization that public shaming had failed to produce a surrender settled over my mother and my sister. They realized my boundaries were not fragile. They could not shame me out of the inheritance, and they could not guilt me into abandoning my father's final wishes. They needed a new lever to pull. If they could not break my reputation, they decided they would break my ability to fight back. They shifted their focus away from the court of public opinion and aimed their sights directly at my wallet. I discovered their next maneuver on Tuesday afternoon when a routine electronic payment for Leo and Maya's preschool tuition bounced back to my inbox, stamped with a bold red notification of insufficient funds. Tuesday afternoon brought a steady, driving rain that lashed against the windows of my home office. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a risk assessment portfolio for a corporate client, enjoying the rhythmic drumming of the storm outside. The quiet productivity of the afternoon shattered when a priority email landed in my inbox. The sender was the administrative director of the twins' preschool. The message was brief and wrapped in professional politeness. It informed me that the monthly tuition draft had been returned by the bank. Stamped in bright red font across the attached receipt were 3 words indicating insufficient funds. I set my reading glasses on the desk. That specific financial channel was never empty. 4 years ago, my father established a shared family account expressly designed to cover educational expenses for his grandchildren. He funded it generously, ensuring Leo and Maya would always have their tuition secured, regardless of any external economic fluctuations. My name remained on the account as a joint signer alongside my parents. I logged into my online banking portal. The dashboard loaded, displaying my personal checking and savings balances. When I clicked the tab for the Shared Educational Trust, a stark gray error code appeared. The account was not empty. It was frozen. Access had been restricted by the primary administrator. Patricia currently held temporary executor status over my father's estate while the probate court processed the initial filings. It is a transitional role meant to keep the lights on and pay the final utility bills. It does not grant the authority to unilaterally freeze joint survivorship accounts without a judge's order. My mother had overstepped her legal boundaries, executing an agonizing financial squeeze designed to test my endurance. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the rain. This was a classic attrition tactic. By cutting off the funds I relied on for daily childcare, she hoped to introduce a sudden, terrifying instability into my routine. She wanted me to panic about my budget, to feel the sharp bite of isolation. She assumed that if she made providing for my children difficult enough, I would eventually cave and surrender my share of the primary estate just to restore the peace. But freezing an account leaves a digital footprint. It requires a signature, a phone call, or a formal request to the bank. It also meant Patricia was actively scrutinizing the estate's cash flow. For weeks, I had harbored a quiet suspicion regarding my mother's spending habits. In the days immediately following the funeral, Patricia began taking frequent, solitary weekend trips. She called them grief retreats. She would pack an overnight bag with cashmere sweaters, douse her wrists in her signature floral perfume, and drive off to luxury wellness resorts in the Berkshires. A grieving widow seeking solace is a common narrative, but Patricia's sudden need for secluded isolation felt rehearsed. I naturally assumed she was funding a secret companion. My parents' marriage had been more of a corporate merger than a romance, and the idea that Patricia was siphoning estate money to entertain a hidden lover fit her profile perfectly. I needed proof of her financial misconduct. Presenting the probate judge with evidence of a temporary executor abusing estate funds would immediately strip her of her administrative power. However, I could not legally breach the bank's security protocols to view the master ledger. Hacking the portal would jeopardize my own standing and hand Jessica a legitimate weapon. I did not need to breach the system. I just needed to wait for Patricia's arrogance to outpace her caution. That evening, the opportunity arrived in my inbox. Patricia sent an email attempting to justify the frozen preschool fund. Her tone was dripping with false sympathy. She wrote about how the estate was in flux, how the legal challenge Jessica filed was tying up liquidity, and how we all needed to tighten our belts during this difficult transition. To bolster her claim of financial hardship, Patricia forwarded a lengthy email thread she had exchanged with the estate CPA. The accountant had been requesting approval for tax preparations. Patricia intended to show me the CPA's warnings about restricted cash flow. She was so focused on delivering her manipulative lecture that she failed to scroll to the very bottom of the forwarded chain. There, nestled beneath weeks of mundane correspondence, was a tiny paperclip icon. The accountant had attached the master PDF ledger of the estate's primary operating account for his final review. I clicked the download button. The file opened, revealing dozens of pages of raw, unformatted financial transactions spanning the last 2 months. To the untrained eye, it was a dizzying wall of dates, routing numbers, and numerical values. To an actuary, it was a gold mine waiting to be excavated. The house was entirely silent. The twins had gone to sleep hours ago. The digital clock in the corner of my monitor glowed brightly, marking the passage of time, as midnight turned into the early hours of the morning. I exported the PDF data into a blank spreadsheet. I formatted the columns, adjusted the margins, and applied a filter to isolate outgoing wire transfers. I color-coded the recurring utility bills, the funeral expenses, and the legal retainer Patricia had paid to the estate attorneys. Once the legitimate expenses were hidden from view, the anomalies stood out like neon signs on a dark highway. My fingers flew across the keyboard, highlighting a distinct pattern of withdrawals. They were not payments to luxury resorts in the Berkshires. They were not charges from high-end restaurants or boutique hotels. My theory about a secret lover crumbled, replaced by something far more sinister. I stared at the glowing screen. By 3 a.m, my spreadsheet detailed 14 distinct unauthorized wire transfers. Patricia had initiated them over the span of 8 weeks. The amounts varied. Sometimes she transferred $4,000, sometimes $7,000. The staggered figures were a clumsy attempt to mimic standard administrative expenses and avoid triggering automated banking alerts for large sum movements. I highlighted the final cell and ran the sum function. The 14 unauthorized wire transfers totaled exactly $65,000. I traced the destination routing numbers attached to each outgoing wire. They all funneled into a single external holding account. I opened a new browser tab and ran a search on the destination bank's routing code, cross-referencing it with the corporate registry database I use for client vetting. The destination account belonged to a limited liability company registered in the state of Connecticut. The registered agent for the LLC was Bradley Vance. Brad was Jessica's husband. He ran an independent contracting business that specialized in high-end residential renovations. Brad was the type of man who spoke loudly at Thanksgiving dinners about his impressive profit margins, yet always arrived driving a leased truck. He wore expensive watches, but his work boots were perpetually clean. I had always suspected his business was a fragile house of cards, propped up by Jessica's credit, but I never imagined the true depth of his financial rot. I sat back in my chair, the ergonomic mesh creaking in the quiet room. The glow of the monitor cast long shadows against the walls. My mother was not taking luxury vacations. She was not protecting the sacred Collins bloodline. She was actively stealing from her dead husband's estate to prop up her son-in-law's failing enterprise. This revelation fundamentally altered the landscape of the war. A dispute over the definition of biological heirs is a civil matter, handled in probate court. Draining $65,000 from an estate while acting as a temporary executor is felony embezzlement. I pressed the print command. The laser printer in the corner of my office whirred to life, churning out pages of highlighted, undeniable proof. Patricia thought she was applying pressure by freezing my children's preschool fund. She did not realize she had just handed me the weapon required to obliterate her freedom. I gathered the warm pages from the printer tray and slid them into a manila folder. I tapped the folder against the desk, aligning the edges. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place, but one glaring question remained unanswered. Why was Patricia risking criminal prosecution to bail out Jessica's husband? Patricia was a selfish woman, but she was deeply risk-averse. She would never jeopardize her own comfortable lifestyle simply to help Brad pay his lumber suppliers. Brad possessed zero leverage over her, or so I thought. I opened a new secure window on my browser and navigated toward the state's public civil docket. If Brad needed exactly $65,000 to survive, there would be a public record explaining his desperation. I typed his name into the search bar, pressed the Enter key, and waited for the legal archives to reveal the true motive behind my mother's treason. The glowing screen illuminated the dark walls of my home office. It was nearing 4 a.m, a time when the world outside is completely devoid of movement. Inside my quiet house, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic clicking of my computer mouse. I had just discovered Patricia's $65,000 embezzlement funneling directly into Bradley Vance's contracting business. The financial bleeding was undeniable. The motive, however, remained a critical missing variable. As an actuary, I rely on the principle of cause and effect. People do not commit felony fraud without a powerful catalyst. Patricia was fiercely protective of her social standing. She would never risk an audit or a criminal charge simply out of the goodness of her heart. Brad was her son-in-law, a man she frequently complained about during country club luncheons, mocking his loud voice and his leased trucks. She viewed him as a necessary nuisance, not a priority worth going to prison for. If my mother was quietly pouring the estate's liquidity into his failing company, it was because she had no other choice. I leaned closer to the monitor. Accessing the state's public civil docket is a standard procedure in my profession. When assessing a corporate client's risk profile, checking for ongoing litigation is the first step. I typed Bradley Vance into the search bar, selected the county jurisdiction, and pressed the Enter key. A loading icon spun for 2 seconds. Then the screen populated with a cascade of terrifying red flags. The search results detailed a financial collapse far more severe than a few overdue lumber invoices. The first entry was a mechanics lien filed by a major regional building supplier. Brad owed them nearly $80,000 for materials he had ordered for a residential renovation project he had subsequently abandoned. The second entry was another lien, this one filed by a subcontractor who had provided electrical framing but had never received a paycheck. I scrolled further down the page. The third entry shifted the focus from his commercial failures directly to his personal life. A major national bank had initiated formal foreclosure proceedings on Brad and Jessica's oversized suburban house. The court filings indicated they had not made a mortgage payment in 7 months. I highlighted the dates on the foreclosure notice. The timeline was damning. The bank had sent the final notice of default 3 weeks before my father suffered his stroke. The narrative suddenly clicked into perfect, devastating focus. This entire war over the estate was never about Jessica's toxic ego. It was never about preserving the sacred Collins heritage, defending the true bloodline, or reclaiming a vintage Rolex. The biological purity argument was nothing more than a convenient dramatic smokescreen. This was about absolute survival. Brad and Jessica were drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. Their sprawling manicured life was a facade, crumbling under the weight of unpaid invoices and impending eviction. When my father died, his $1.2 million trust became their only available life raft. But the trust was divided into thirds. A 1/3 share would barely cover Brad's business liens, let alone save their house and sustain their lifestyle. They needed the entire pie. They needed to eliminate my share, and they needed to eliminate the shares allocated to Leo and Maya. If they could successfully argue that my adopted children were not legal heirs, the math shifted in their favor. If they could push me to surrender, they could walk away with the entire estate and erase their financial ruin overnight. I opened a new folder on my desktop and began saving every court docket as a high-resolution PDF. I cataloged the supplier liens. I archived the foreclosure notices. I organized the public records with the same clinical precision I apply to my corporate risk models. While I downloaded the files, a deeper, darker realization began to take shape in my mind. The public dockets explained Jessica's desperate legal strategy, but they did not explain the covert wire transfers. Why was Patricia illegally funding Brad right now, before the estate was even settled? If Jessica won the lawsuit, the money would eventually be theirs. Why risk embezzlement in the interim? I stared at the spreadsheet detailing the 14 unauthorized transfers. The payments were erratic: $4,000 on a Tuesday, $7,000 the following Thursday, $9,000 a week later. These were not strategic business investments. These were panic payments. These were the hallmarks of an extortion schedule. The $65,000 was not a bailout. It was blackmail. Brad was holding a secret over my mother's head. He had discovered something so deeply damaging, so incredibly toxic to Patricia's carefully constructed reality, that he could demand thousands of dollars in hush money on a weekly basis. My mother, terrified of exposure, was bleeding her dead husband's estate dry to keep Brad quiet. Simultaneously, Jessica was utilizing the legal system to strip me of my rightful inheritance, aiming to secure the rest of the fortune before the foreclosure destroyed her social standing. They were thieves wrapping themselves in the holy flag of family loyalty. They had sat in that mahogany-paneled law office projecting an air of aristocratic grief, weaponizing the concept of biological purity while secretly orchestrating a coordinated heist. They assumed I was too soft, too focused on my children, and too committed to avoiding conflict to ever look beneath the floorboards. I sat back in my chair. The exhaustion of the late hour vanished, replaced by a cold, humming energy. I had spent my entire life acting as the family shock absorber. I had compromised my own comfort to accommodate Jessica's tantrums. I had endured Patricia's manipulative sweetness to keep the holiday dinners peaceful. I had allowed them to mistake my patience for weakness. That dynamic ended tonight. I was not just going to beat them in probate court. I was going to dismantle their lives. I was going to let them build their arrogant legal foundation, let them weave their web of biological purity, and then I was going to detonate the evidence directly beneath their feet. I closed the browser tabs and shut down the computer. The digital clock read 4:30 in the morning. I gathered the printed spreadsheets, the downloaded court dockets, and the Facebook screenshots, slipping them all into a heavy leather binder. I locked the binder in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I walked down the hallway, the hardwood floor cold against my bare feet. I stopped outside the twins' bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. I stood in the threshold, watching Leo and Maya sleep beneath their colorful quilts. Their presence anchored my resolve. They were the true legacy of this family, a legacy built on choice love and unwavering commitment. No desperate, bankrupt relatives were going to erase them. I walked into my kitchen and poured a glass of water. As I stood by the sink, my gaze drifted to the granite counter. The cream-colored envelope rested exactly where I had left it, perfectly aligned next to the salt shaker. The secret Brad was using to blackmail my mother, the truth my father had guarded for decades. It was all waiting inside that sealed parchment. Greg Halloran had told me to wait until Jessica locked herself into her legal argument. Her petition was filed, her public smear campaign had run its course, and her husband was actively extorting the estate. The trap she was building for me was nearly complete. I set the glass down. It was time to arm myself. It was time to read the final message my father had left behind and uncover the exact nature of the weapon he had placed in my hands. The kitchen was perfectly still. The only illumination came from the small amber light above the stove. I stood at the granite counter looking down at the cream envelope resting beside the salt shaker. I had spent days walking past it, resisting the urge to break the seal, honoring Greg Halloran's professional caution. The anticipation had acted as an anchor, but discovering Brad's financial ruin and Patricia's embezzlement had shifted the timeline. The enemy was accelerating their maneuvers. I needed to know exactly what kind of ammunition my father had provided. I picked up the envelope. The paper felt heavy and substantial. I slid my index finger under the flap and broke the seal. Inside, I found 2 items. The first was a single sheet of personal stationery, folded precisely in half. The second was a brittle, yellowed document printed on vintage medical letterhead. I set the medical document down and unfolded the personal stationery. The familiar slanted blue ink of my father's handwriting filled the page. The letters were steady and deliberate, written by a man who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly when this letter would be read. I read the opening line. "Kaylee, if you are reading this, it means they went after your kids." A sharp breath caught in my throat. He had known. He had possessed an absolute crystalline understanding of the people sharing his roof. He knew my mother's obsession with appearances, and he knew Jessica's unyielding entitlement. He knew that when he was no longer standing in the room to enforce the boundaries, they would immediately attempt to erase the children he loved simply because Leo and Maya did not share his DNA. I kept reading. "I am sorry I am not there to stop them," the letter continued. "I loved Jessica. I raised her. I provided for her, and I considered her my daughter in every way that mattered. That is why I kept this secret. I wanted to protect her childhood from the destruction her mother caused. But I also knew a day might come when they would use my silence as a weapon against you. I will not allow them to dismantle your family using a fabricated standard of purity. I have left you the tool to end this. Do not feel guilty for using it. You are simply showing them the mirror." I lowered the stationery. My father's words were a mixture of profound sorrow and cold, calculated protection. He had absorbed a massive betrayal, carrying the weight of it for decades, all to maintain a facade of peace for a child who would eventually attempt to steal his legacy. I set the letter aside and picked up the yellowed medical document. The paper was brittle, the edges slightly frayed. The letterhead belonged to a urology clinic operating out of New Haven during the late 1980s. The date printed at the top right corner was exactly 34 years ago. I scanned the typewritten text. It was a formal diagnostic report signed by a specialist whose name I did not recognize. The medical jargon was dense, but the conclusion was stated with absolute, undeniable clarity. My father had contracted a severe viral infection during an overseas business trip. The infection had caused massive internal complications. The resulting damage was permanent. The physician had documented in clinical, legally binding language that Richard Collins was entirely and irreversibly sterile. The report confirmed a sperm count of 0. The condition was untreatable. I stared at the numbers printed on the page. I am an actuary. I spend my life calculating probabilities and verifying timelines. My brain immediately began running the math, processing the dates with ruthless efficiency. I am 36 years old. I was born 2 years prior to the date on this medical report. I was his biological child conceived before the infection stole his fertility. Jessica is 33 years old. She was conceived and born a full year after this document confirmed my father was physically incapable of fathering a child. The math was absolute. It was a closed equation with only one possible solution. Patricia had an affair. My mother, the woman who constantly preached about the sacred Collins heritage, the woman who spun elaborate fables about Jessica inheriting a mythical recessive gene for blue eyes, the woman who demanded strict adherence to the true bloodline, had engaged in an extramarital affair. She had gotten pregnant by another man and seamlessly passed the child off as my father's own. I leaned against the granite counter, the cold stone pressing into my lower back. The magnitude of the deception was staggering. Patricia had lived a lie for 3 decades, constructing an arrogant, elitist persona to mask a fundamental betrayal. She had demanded total loyalty to a lineage she herself had broken. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together, forming a horrifying, complete picture. This was the secret Brad had discovered. Brad had likely stumbled upon some artifact of this affair, an old letter, a stray medical bill, or perhaps an inconsistency in a routine blood test. Knowing Patricia's absolute terror of public humiliation, he recognized the leverage immediately. When his contracting business began to fail and the foreclosure notices arrived, he did not file for bankruptcy. He turned to extortion. He demanded $65,000 in hush money to keep his mouth shut, and Patricia, desperate to maintain her pristine social standing and her fabricated reality, began embezzling from my father's estate to pay him off. My father had known everything. For 33 years, he had sat at the head of the Thanksgiving table, listening to Patricia boast about the Collins genetics, knowing the entire narrative was a fiction. He had absorbed the betrayal, prioritizing Jessica's stable childhood over his own pride. He had been the ultimate shock absorber. But he was also a pragmatist. He knew that upon his death, Patricia's greed and Jessica's arrogance would likely target the most vulnerable members of the family. He meticulously archived the medical proof, waiting for the precise moment it would be needed to protect Leo and Maya. I sat in the dark kitchen, feeling the sheer weight of his posthumous protection. It was a terrifying, magnificent gift. I picked up the urology report. Jessica had hired a boutique litigation firm. She had filed a formal, sworn petition with the probate court. She had demanded that the judge strictly define the term descendants as unbroken biological offspring. She had anchored her entire legal strategy on the premise that only true genetic relatives deserved a share of Richard Collins's wealth. By insisting on a rigid biological standard, she had built an inescapable trap. She thought she was building a cage for my adopted children. She did not realize she had literally just evicted herself from the estate. Under the very legal definition she had formally petitioned the court to enforce, Jessica had no right to a single dime. She had no right to the trust funds. She had no right to the property. She certainly had no right to the vintage Rolex she coveted so deeply. If the court honored her petition, I was the sole remaining biological heir. A cold, razor-sharp focus settled over my mind. The fear and anxiety that had plagued me since the reading of the will evaporated entirely. I folded the medical document and placed it carefully back into the cream envelope. I placed my father's handwritten letter beside it. I walked to my office, unlocked the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, and placed the envelope next to the heavy leather binder containing the public foreclosure dockets and the embezzlement spreadsheets. I closed the drawer and turned the key. My sister wanted a war based on blood. She wanted to use genetics as a weapon to erase my family. She had launched public smear campaigns and hired aggressive attorneys to force my surrender. I was not going to surrender. I was not going to negotiate. I was going to let her march her legal argument all the way into the courtroom, and then I was going to hand her the exact biological purity she had demanded. The battle lines were drawn and the artillery was loaded. All I needed now was a specific strategy to deploy the weapon without allowing her a chance to retreat. The memory of a childhood lesson provided the exact tactical blueprint I required. The sun breached the horizon, casting pale morning light across the hardwood floor of my office. I stood by the filing cabinet. I had retrieved the cream envelope to transfer its contents into my daily work bag. I held the brittle medical document in my hands one more time. The yellowed parchment felt fragile between my fingertips. The faint scent of old ink and stored paper drifted upward. That specific aroma functioned as a sudden key, unlocking a door in my mind and pulling me backward through time. I was 12 years old again. Outside the windows, a heavy spring rain washed over the Connecticut suburbs. I sat in my father's study. The room was his personal sanctuary, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and smelling faintly of polished leather and rain-damp wool. We were situated on opposite sides of a heavy oak table. Between us rested his prized possession, a hand-carved marble chessboard. I studied the pieces, resting my chin on my palms. I was losing the match. My father played chess the same way he lived his life. He was patient, deliberate, and always operating several steps ahead of the visible board. Our quiet concentration shattered. A high-pitched shriek echoed up the staircase. It was Jessica. She was 9 years old and in the midst of a full-blown temper tantrum in the foyer below. The muffled sounds of her demands vibrated through the floorboards. She was crying over a trivial, perceived injustice. She wanted to attend a birthday party she had not been invited to, and she expected our mother to fix the slight. Patricia's soothing, enabling voice drifted up the stairs, promising to call the host and demand an invitation. Patricia was coddling the exact behavior that would eventually ruin my sister's character. I looked up from the chessboard. Frustration burned in my 12-year-old chest. I asked my father why he never stopped them. I asked why he sat in his quiet study while Patricia reinforced Jessica's endless entitlement. I wanted him to march downstairs, raise his voice, and enforce a boundary. My father did not stand up. He did not sigh. He reached out and rested his index finger on the top of his black knight. His hazel eyes locked onto mine, carrying a profound, weary wisdom I was too young to fully comprehend. Never interrupt your opponent when they are making a mistake. Kaylee, he said quietly, he slid the knight across the checkered marble squares. Let them move their queen. You only strike when they cannot take the move back. The memory faded, leaving me standing in my quiet home office. I looked down at the 34-year-old urology report resting in my hands. The resonance of his advice struck me with profound clarity. My father had not been retreating from Patricia and Jessica all those years ago. He had been observing them. He recognized that engaging with a tantrum merely validates the noise. He understood that true victory requires letting the opposition commit to a flawed strategy until retreat becomes impossible. That childhood lesson anchored my entire strategy moving forward. If I drove to Greg Halloran's office today and revealed the sterility report, the element of surprise would vanish. Greg would file the document with the probate court. Harrison Caldwell, Jessica's expensive litigator, would receive a copy. Caldwell was a pragmatic professional. The moment he read a verified medical report proving Jessica shared 0 DNA with Richard Collins, he would immediately withdraw the current petition. He would advise Jessica to abandon the biological purity argument because it guaranteed her defeat. Caldwell would pivot. He would draft a new filing. He would argue that the codicil was invalid due to undue influence, or claim my father lacked the mental capacity to sign it, utilizing vague psychological arguments that could drag the estate through years of expensive litigation. Under a generic dispute, Jessica might still walk away with a third of the trust. I did not want her to walk away with a third. I wanted her to face the exact consequences of her own arrogant demands. She wanted to play the queen of the biological bloodline. She had built her entire identity and her legal strategy around the concept of genetic supremacy. She had weaponized the word family to exclude Leo and Maya. My father's advice echoed in my ears. I needed to let her march that queen right into the center of the board. I needed Jessica to push her legal arguments so far into the public record that the presiding judge could never undo it. She had to stand before a mediator, sign her name to a formal stipulation, and bind her fate entirely to the biological standard. Once she locked herself into that unalterable position, her attorney could not pivot. When the trap snapped shut, it had to be a definitive checkmate. I folded the vintage medical record along its original creases. I walked over to my desk and opened my leather briefcase. I placed the urology report into a clear protective sleeve. I placed it in the back compartment. I retrieved the printed spreadsheets detailing Patricia's embezzlement. I placed them in the middle compartment. I gathered the downloaded public dockets exposing Brad's foreclosure and mechanics liens. I slid those into the front pocket. My briefcase ceased to be a simple work accessory. It transformed into a portable vault. It held the financial ruin, the criminal liability, and the genetic truth of the people attempting to destroy my children. I closed the brass clasps on the leather bag. The heavy clicks resonated in the quiet room. I was prepared to walk into the final stages of their ambush. My father had provided the checkmate years before he ever took his final breath. I merely needed to exercise the patience required to let them set the board. I spent the rest of the morning engaging in my standard routine. I fed the twins breakfast, packed their lunches, and drove them to their preschool. I returned home and logged into my work portal, analyzing risk models for corporate clients. I operated with a steady, unbothered rhythm. The anxiety that had hovered over me for the past month had dissipated, replaced by a cold, calculating endurance. However, my refusal to engage was having the opposite effect on my sister. Narcissists require friction to sustain their reality. When they meet a wall of silence, their internal panic amplifies. Jessica and Brad had expected me to fold after the Facebook smear campaign. They had expected me to beg for a settlement after Patricia froze the Educational Trust Fund. My continued absence from their dramatic narrative was driving them toward a desperate breaking point. They could no longer tolerate the silence. They needed to force a reaction. If I would not answer my phone, and if I would not defend myself online, they decided they would invade my physical space. They orchestrated an unannounced confrontation, choosing a location where I would be most vulnerable and least likely to cause a scene. I discovered their new tactic later that afternoon when I took Leo and Maya to the neighborhood playground. The neighborhood playground on a Thursday afternoon serves as a quiet sanctuary for local parents. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of crushed oak leaves and distant wood smoke. I stood behind a thick rubber swing, pushing Leo in a steady, metronomic rhythm. The rusty metal chains emitted a faint rhythmic squeak with every pendulum arc. A few yards away, Maya was meticulously building a fortress out of damp sand, her small hands shaping the walls. Several other mothers sat on a cluster of green wooden benches nearby, sipping coffee from paper cups and exchanging low conversation. It was a picture of suburban normalcy, a brief respite from the suffocating legal battle consuming my private life. The tranquility fractured when an oversized luxury sport utility vehicle pulled into the parking lot adjacent to the playground. The vehicle belonged to Brad. I recognized the custom chrome rims, a frivolous purchase he had authorized months before his bank began issuing default notices. The driver's side door swung open, and Brad stepped onto the asphalt. Jessica emerged from the passenger side. She wore a tailored wool trench coat, her hair styled into effortless waves. From a distance, she projected an image of upper-class stability and leisure. However, my forensic training conditioned me to look past the macro presentation and focus intently on the micro indicators. As they crossed the wood chips toward the swing set, the hidden fractures in their facade became glaringly apparent. Brad wore a designer polo shirt, but the collar was slightly frayed, and his posture slouched under an invisible, crushing weight. He walked with a hurried, anxious gait. Jessica gripped her expensive handbag with white knuckles. They had not come to the park for a casual afternoon stroll. Harper was nowhere in sight. They had tracked me down because my week of strategic silence had starved their narcissistic engines, pushing their internal anxiety to a boiling point. They needed a confrontation before the legal proceedings resumed. Brad stopped less than 2 feet from my right shoulder. The physical proximity was a deliberate tactic designed to intimidate and attempt to invade my personal space and provoke a defensive reaction. The cold afternoon breeze shifted, carrying his distinct scent. He smelled of stale espresso and an overpowering application of strong cologne, a heavy fragrance utilized to mask the sour odor of nervous perspiration. Jessica bypassed me entirely and leaned her shoulder against the metal support beam of the swing structure. She positioned herself facing the cluster of mothers on the wooden benches, treating the playground equipment like a theater stage. "Hello, Kaylee," Jessica said. She pitched her volume several decibels higher than necessary for a private conversation. The chatter among the women on the benches abruptly ceased. Heads turned in our direction. Jessica had successfully secured her audience. "The mediation is tomorrow morning," Jessica announced, projecting her voice across the sandbox. "I hope you have prepared yourself. It is going to be incredibly sad when the judge formally declares your kids are not part of the family." I did not stop pushing the swing. I kept my hands flat against Leo's small back, guiding him forward, catching him gently on the return. The pendulum motion remained uninterrupted. The physics of momentum require a steady hand, and I applied that same principle to my emotional state. "It is a tragedy." Jessica continued adopting a tone of theatrical pity. She placed a hand over her heart, a gesture so rehearsed it belonged in a daytime soap opera. "Dad was just being charitable, but blood is blood. You cannot rewrite genetics with an adoption certificate. I am just protecting the true lineage. Do not take it personally." The dramatic irony hanging in the air felt like a tangible, physical weight. She was standing in a public park, bragging to an audience of strangers about the supreme importance of a genetic bloodline she did not even possess. She was boasting about a standard of biological purity that would soon strip her of her own identity and her entire inheritance. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over my nervous system. I shifted my gaze away from my sister and focused on her husband. Brad stood rigidly, his arms crossed tight over his chest. I observed the subtle, involuntary muscle spasms occurring just beneath his left eye. A twitching eyelid is a classic physiological response to chronic stress and severe sleep deprivation. He was a man drowning in unpaid contractor liens, facing the imminent loss of his home, while simultaneously managing a high-stakes extortion scheme against his mother-in-law. The pressure was actively eroding his nervous system, and his body was betraying his panic. I looked back at Jessica. She was waiting for the tears. She expected me to snatch my children from the playground equipment and flee toward my vehicle in shame. She wanted me to shout to create a scene that would validate her narrative of the hysterical, entitled sibling. Instead, I offered her a warm, genuine smile. "I am looking forward to tomorrow, Jessica," I said. My voice was quiet, even, and devoid of any defensive edge. The truth always comes out, eventually. The response derailed her script. She blinked, her rehearsed confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. She searched my face for a trace of sarcasm or fear, but she found nothing except tranquil certainty. Because she operated entirely on ego, she misinterpreted my composure. She assumed I was trapped in a state of delusional denial. She genuinely believed I was simply too fragile to accept my impending legal defeat. Jessica scoffed a short, dismissive sound. She rolled her eyes for the benefit of the watching mothers, playing the role of the exasperated sibling dealing with a lunatic. "Right. Well, see you at the table," she muttered. She turned on her heel and walked away, her designer boots crunching against the wood chips. Brad lingered for a moment, his twitching eye darting toward my face as if searching for a hidden trap, before turning to follow his wife. They linked arms as they marched back toward their least luxury vehicle. It was a performative display of unity, two desperate conspirators bound together by debt and deceit, marching confidently toward their own destruction. I watched the SUV pull out of the parking lot and merge onto the main road. They believed they had just executed a brilliant campaign of psychological warfare. They thought they had rattled my cage and asserted their dominance on the eve of the probate negotiations. They did not comprehend that I was merely observing the oblivious subjects of an impending legal execution. Their noise, their insults, and their intimidation tactics bounced harmlessly off the fortress of documented facts I had meticulously constructed. Tomorrow was the mandatory mediation session. It was the designated arena where the opposing legal teams would meet to discuss potential settlements before appearing before a probate judge. Harrison Caldwell would be sitting at the mahogany table, ready to demand my surrender. Jessica would be waiting to formally bind the estate to her genetic rules. I gently stopped the swing, gathered Leo and Maya, and guided them toward our car. The psychological skirmishes in the suburbs were officially over. The time had arrived to sit across from my adversaries, review their formal demands, and let them sign the legally binding paperwork that would permanently seal their fate. The conference room inside the mediation center smelled of stale coffee and heavily polished wood. It was Friday morning, the designated hour for opposing counsels to clash before dragging a dispute before a probate judge. I arrived 10 minutes early alongside Greg Halloran. We sat on the eastern side of a massive mahogany table. Greg unpacked a slim, unmarked folder from his briefcase, resting it precisely parallel to the table edge. I placed my hands flat against the cool surface, adopting the same clinical detachment I bring to corporate risk assessments. The door opened precisely at 9 o'clock. Harrison Caldwell entered first, striding into the room with the aggressive confidence of a litigator who measures success by billing hours and broken spirits. Jessica followed closely behind him, radiating an unmistakable aura of smugness. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, treating the legal negotiation like a high-stakes social event. Brad flanked her, carrying a leather folio, though the heavy sheen of perspiration on his forehead betrayed the crippling anxiety gnawing at his nerves. My mother, Patricia, entered last. She took a seat in a leather chair positioned slightly away from the main table, retreating into the corner. She wore dark sunglasses, which she slowly removed to reveal a performative expression of maternal sorrow. She pulled a pressed linen handkerchief from her purse and began dabbing at the dry corners of her eyes. The mediator, a neutral, gray-haired retired judge named Arbiter Higgins, sat at the head of the table. He recited the standard introductory preamble regarding civil discourse and the benefits of avoiding lengthy litigation. Harrison Caldwell did not wait for Higgins to finish his opening remarks. He reached into his leather satchel and extracted a thick legal document. With a practiced, dramatic flourish, he slapped the paperwork down onto the center of the mahogany table. The sharp crack echoed against the glass windows. "We are not here to negotiate a compromise," Arbiter Higgins Caldwell announced. His voice was loud, engineered to dominate the airspace. "My client is asserting her absolute right to the original terms of the Collins Trust. We have submitted a formal petition defining descendants as unbroken biological offspring. We are here to enforce that definition." Caldwell slid a single sheet of paper from the stack and pushed it across the polished wood until it rested inches from my folded hands. "To definitively prove the lineage and exclude the adopted children from the estate," Caldwell said, allowing a faint sneer to curl the edge of his lip, "my client is filing a formal stipulation demanding a court-ordered DNA test. We will secure medical verification that Kaylee's children share zero genetic material with Richard Collins. Once the biology is confirmed, the codicil is rendered void under the grandfather clause." The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. This was the crescendo of their escalation. This was the moment they believed I would finally break. I glanced at my mother. Patricia was clutching her linen handkerchief, her knuckles turning white, staring intently at the floorboards. She wanted me to surrender so she could return to her comfortable, fictional reality. I looked at Brad. He was running a finger under his shirt collar, silently praying I would concede the battle and inadvertently release the trust funds required to pay off his blackmail demands. Finally, I looked at Jessica. My sister leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany surface. Her eyes were bright with anticipation. She was vibrating with triumph, waiting for the outrage. She expected me to launch into a passionate defense of adoption. She expected me to accuse her of cruelty, to cry out against the indignity of subjecting Leo and Maya to a clinical swab simply to prove their worth. I did not raise my voice. I did not move my hands from the table. I looked at the legal stipulation Caldwell had provided. I read the formal language demanding genetic verification. Then I lifted my gaze and met my sister's bright, expectant eyes. I offered her a cold, small smile. "I agree," I said smoothly. The two words dropped into the quiet room like heavy stones striking deep water. The absolute lack of resistance derailed the tension Caldwell had meticulously engineered. Jessica blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. Caldwell frowned, his hand hovering over his remaining documents. He had prepared for a vicious legal counterattack, not an immediate, tranquil concession. "You agree to the genetic testing?" Arbiter Higgins asked, clarifying the statement for the official record. "I do," I replied, shifting my gaze to the mediator. "However, if we are establishing an absolute biological lineage for the probate court, the process must be entirely comprehensive. We cannot submit partial data to a judge when the entire estate hinges on genetic purity." I turned my attention back to Jessica and her attorney. "I want everyone tested," I stated, my voice echoing with rigid actuarial precision. "I want a complete biological audit of the claiming parties. You, me, Harper, and the twins. We utilize an independent court-approved laboratory. Every individual submits a sample. We run the profiles, and we submit the comprehensive results directly to the judge without redaction. If we are enforcing the strict biological rules of the grandfather clause, we verify every single branch of the family tree." Jessica let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. She leaned back in her chair, shaking her head. She viewed my demand as a pathetic, desperate maneuver. In her mind, I was throwing a tantrum, attempting to drag the rest of the family through an inconvenient medical procedure simply to delay the inevitable moment my children were disqualified. "Fine," Jessica said. The word was laced with profound arrogance. She picked up a heavy silver pen from the center console. "Let us prove exactly who belongs in this family, Kaylee. If you want to waste everyone's time proving I am Dad's daughter, I am more than happy to oblige." She pulled the legal stipulation toward her side of the table. She uncapped the silver pen and signed her name with a series of aggressive, looping strokes. She pressed so hard the ink nearly bled through the parchment. She slid the paper back across the table. I picked up my own pen and signed my name directly beneath hers. Greg Halloran reached out, took the document, and placed it securely inside his unmarked folder. He nodded at Arbiter Higgins. The agreement was finalized. The legal framework was permanently locked in place. Jessica stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her charcoal blazer. She looked down at me, her expression radiating absolute victory. She thought she had just built an inescapable guillotine for Leo and Maya. She believed the science would validate her entitlement and secure her financial rescue. She turned and marched out of the conference room, Brad trailing closely behind her, the heavy wooden door swinging shut in their wake. Patricia remained in the corner for a moment longer. She lowered her sunglasses, offering me a look of deep, profound disappointment before rising and following her favored daughter into the hallway. I sat at the mahogany table alongside Greg Halloran. I listened to their fading footsteps. My sister had just signed a legally binding document mandating a comprehensive genetic audit of the Collins family. She had voluntarily authorized a court-appointed laboratory to analyze her DNA and submit the findings directly to a probate judge. She had anchored her entire future on the unshakable premise of biological purity. She did not realize she had just proudly and legally handed me the exact length of rope required to hang her own branch of the family tree. The theoretical arguments were over. The psychological warfare had concluded. All that remained was the physical execution of the test. The battlefield was shifting from the mahogany conference table to a sterile clinical laboratory, where the unalterable truth of science would permanently dismantle her fabricated reality. Which brings us back to Tuesday morning at the genetic testing facility. The weather mirrored the sterile nature of our errand. A low gray cloud cover hung over the city, stripping the autumn leaves of their vibrancy and casting a flat, shadowless light across the pavement. I parked my car in the expansive asphalt lot and unbuckled Leo and Maya from their car seats. I held their hands as we walked toward the glass entrance. They wore their favorite bright yellow rain boots, their small, energetic steps providing a sharp contrast to the grim reality of our destination. They believed we were visiting a doctor for a simple routine checkup. I intended to keep that innocent illusion intact. The clinic waiting room smelled heavily of industrial bleach and synthetic lavender air freshener. The walls were painted a muted clinical beige, designed to soothe anxious patients, but ultimately failing to mask the inherent tension of the environment. A low hum emanated from the ceiling ventilation grates. When I pushed through the double doors, the distinct sound of my sister holding court filled the reception area. Jessica stood at the front desk, resting her designer handbag on the transaction counter. She treated the medical waiting room like her own personal red carpet. She wore a tailored cashmere coat and a pair of dark, oversized sunglasses perched on top of her head. She was leaning forward, speaking to the exhausted receptionist in a loud, performative tone, engineered to ensure every other patient in the room heard her words. "We are here for an estate verification," Jessica announced, tapping her credit card against the laminate surface. "It is a highly sensitive legal matter regarding a private trust. We need to expedite the processing time. The probate judge is waiting on these results to finalize the distribution of the Collins lineage." The receptionist, a woman wearing teal scrubs and a look of profound boredom, simply handed Jessica a plastic clipboard containing standard intake forms. The clinic handled paternity disputes, immigration DNA verifications, and forensic genetic audits every single day. Jessica's manufactured drama did not register on the employee's radar. I guided the twins toward a cluster of chairs situated near a potted artificial ficus tree. I sat down and surveyed the rest of the room. My mother occupied a single chair in the far corner, positioning herself as far away from the front desk as the architecture allowed. Patricia wore a beige trench coat buttoned to her throat. She gripped her leather purse with both hands, anchoring it to her lap like a life raft in a turbulent ocean. I studied her posture. For 34 years, Patricia had maintained a flawless, aristocratic facade. She thrived on projecting an image of effortless superiority. Today, that pristine exterior was fracturing under the weight of her own hidden history. Her spine was rigid. Her shoulders were drawn up near her ears. Every few seconds, her gaze darted toward the swinging wooden door that led back to the laboratory examination rooms. I knew exactly why she was terrified. Patricia lived with the knowledge of her decades-old affair. She knew Jessica did not share Richard Collins's genetic material. However, my mother was desperately clinging to a flawed, uneducated assumption regarding the mechanics of this specific medical procedure. Patricia believed this test was a simple sibling comparison. She assumed the laboratory would extract DNA from me and extract DNA from Jessica, comparing our markers to determine our relation. She likely hoped the results would confirm we shared the same mother, perhaps blurring the lines of paternity just enough to introduce reasonable doubt into the court proceedings. She prayed the science would be murky, offering her a sliver of plausible deniability. She thought she could navigate the fallout by claiming genetic anomalies or testing errors. She did not comprehend the meticulous groundwork Greg Halloran had laid the previous afternoon. Greg had not filed paperwork for a simple sibling comparison. When Jessica signed the formal stipulation demanding a comprehensive biological audit of the claiming parties, she triggered a specific legal protocol. The preceding day, Greg had driven to this exact clinic and hand-delivered a sealed evidentiary package. 4 years ago, when my father placed the cream envelope in Greg's possession, he also authorized his primary care physician to extract and secure a baseline biological sample. Greg had stored a verified, medically authenticated blood card within the firm's refrigerated evidentiary vault. Greg transferred that baseline sample directly to the laboratory technicians. The clinic was not going to compare my sister to me. The laboratory computers were going to run our fresh profiles directly against the verified, unalterable DNA of Richard Collins. Patricia was sitting in the corner holding her breath, entirely unaware that the ghost of her dead husband was already resting inside the laboratory computers, waiting to deliver the final verdict. A nurse wearing a blue laboratory coat pushed open the wooden door and called my name. I stood up, holding Leo and Maya by the hand, and walked into the sterile examination room. The physical process was remarkably brief. The nurse possessed a gentle, reassuring demeanor. She explained the procedure to the twins, calling it a magic cotton swab tickle. She rubbed the sterile applicator against the inside of Maya's cheek for 10 seconds, placed the tip into a plastic vial, and snapped the cap shut. She repeated the process for Leo. I went last, opening my mouth and allowing the synthetic fibers to collect the necessary genetic material. I felt a profound sense of tranquility as the nurse labeled my vial. My children were safe. Their worth was not determined by the microscopic strings of data resting inside those plastic tubes. Their value was cemented by the love my father had given them. This clinical exercise was merely a procedural formality required to disarm a thief. We exited the examination room and returned to the waiting area. Jessica immediately stood up from her chair. She handed her completed clipboard to Brad, who looked pale and nauseous, and marched toward the swinging wooden door with eager anticipation. Harper trailed behind her, oblivious to the high-stakes theater her mother was conducting. "Make sure you get a good sample," Jessica ordered the nurse, her voice echoing down the narrow hallway. "We need to prove the pure Collins lineage today. I want the extraction done perfectly." I stopped near the doorway, adjusting Leo's rain jacket. I turned my head just enough to watch the scene unfold inside the examination room. Jessica tilted her head back, her eyes bright with arrogant triumph. She opened her mouth. The nurse reached forward. I watched the cotton swab press into the inside of my sister's cheek. The visual mirrored the exact moment the war began. It was the physical manifestation of her own hubris. She believed she was providing the biological key required to unlock a vast fortune. She thought she was building an inescapable guillotine for my children, securing her financial rescue and validating her lifelong superiority complex. She did not realize the trap had officially snapped shut. The second that cotton swab touched her internal tissue, her fate was sealed. The genetic data transferred onto those fibers would travel into a centrifuge, where it would inevitably fail to match the baseline sample resting in the system. There was no going back. She could not withdraw the stipulation. She could not claim a false result. She had demanded the test, she had signed the binding legal contract, and she had provided the evidence of her own illegitimacy. I watched the nurse seal Jessica's vial inside a plastic bag. The unalterable truth of science was now locked behind a tamper-evident zipper. I turned away from the hallway and looked across the waiting room. My mother was staring directly at me. Patricia had lowered her sunglasses. Her eyes were wide-rimmed with red, searching my face for any indication of the impending results. She was looking for a sign of panic, a telltale hint that I felt threatened by the procedure we had just completed. I stood in the center of the beige room. I let the silence stretch between us, allowing the quiet weight of the moment to settle over her shoulders. Then, I smiled. It was not a large theatrical grin. It was a cold, precise expression of absolute certainty. It was the smile of a forensic actuary who has already calculated the final sum and knows the opposing ledger is bankrupt. Patricia saw the smile. The blood drained from her face, leaving her complexion the color of old ash. The strained composure she had maintained for 3 decades fractured in real time. She recognized the total absence of fear in my posture. She understood in that fleeting, silent exchange that I knew something she did not. Patricia looked away in terror. She raised a trembling hand to her mouth, staring blankly at the synthetic floor tiles, suddenly realizing the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. I gathered my children and walked out the glass doors into the cool, gray morning. The physical execution was finished. All that remained was the brief incubation period required for the laboratory to process the data, followed by the delivery of the final, devastating sum. The forensic laboratory required 21 days to process the genetic material, verify the profiles against the baseline, and generate the certified reports. For 3 weeks, my family operated under a tense, suspended ceasefire. Jessica refrained from posting any further cryptic messages online. Brad's contracting business remained technically afloat, likely sustained by the illusion that a massive influx of trust funds was imminent. Patricia avoided calling my phone, her previous confidence replaced by the profound, paralyzing dread that had settled over her in the clinic waiting room. I utilized the quiet period to finalize my preparations. I reviewed the embezzlement spreadsheets, cataloged the foreclosure dockets, and secured the original urology report inside a fresh, protective sleeve. On a Thursday afternoon, my cell phone vibrated. The screen displayed Greg Halloran's private office number. I answered on the first ring. The courier just delivered the sealed documentation, Greg informed me. His gravelly voice maintained its characteristic, unhurried cadence. The genetic audit is complete. The results are certified by the medical examiner. Did you review the findings, I asked? I did, Greg replied. A brief, pregnant pause hung over the cellular connection. The data aligns perfectly with the medical history your father provided 4 years ago. The mathematical probability leaves 0 room for legal maneuvering. The trap is closed, Kaylee. Thank you, Greg. I will contact Harrison Caldwell's office and schedule a formal disclosure meeting at the mediation center, Greg suggested. It is the standard protocol for handling volatile evidentiary reveals. No, I countered immediately. I looked around my home office, my gaze resting on the framed photograph of my father holding Leo and Maya on his lap. He had absorbed 34 years of deception to maintain a facade of domestic tranquility for his youngest daughter. They had repaid his quiet sacrifice by attempting to erase the grandchildren he cherished. A sterile conference room with a neutral mediator was an insufficient arena for this specific reckoning. This betrayal originated within the architecture of our family, and the consequences needed to be delivered in a setting that reflected that intimate reality. I do not want to do this in a boardroom, I told Greg. I want to do it here, in my house, around a dining table. I want them to feel entirely comfortable, right up until the moment the floor collapses. Greg considered the request. It is highly unorthodox. It carries a significant risk of extreme emotional volatility. I am an actuary, Greg. I am comfortable managing volatility. Very well, he agreed. What is the schedule? Sunday afternoon, I instructed. 4 o'clock. I ended the call and opened the messaging application on my smartphone. I drafted a single, concise group text addressed to Patricia and Jessica. Sunday dinner at my house, 4 p.m. We will review the laboratory results and finalize the estate distribution. I pressed send. The response arrived less than 2 minutes later. Patricia sent a message filled with relief and manufactured warmth. She praised my sensible decision to finally come to the table. In her mind, an invitation to a Sunday roast signaled a total surrender. She assumed the laboratory had delivered ambiguous results. Or perhaps she simply believed the gravity of an impending court date had finally crushed my resolve. She thought I was waving a white flag, inviting them into my home to negotiate a private settlement before the judge could formally strike my children from the record. Sunday arrived bearing clear, crisp autumn weather. I spent the morning preparing the environment with the same meticulous attention to detail I apply to corporate audits. I wanted the sensory experience to project an atmosphere of absolute domestic normalcy. I prepared a large beef roast, seasoning the meat heavily with garlic, coarse salt, and fresh herbs. By 3 o'clock, the rich, savory smell of roasting beef and rosemary filled the entire house. It was a warm, comforting aroma, deeply associated with Sunday family gatherings and peaceful resolutions. It was the perfect olfactory camouflage for an impending execution. I transitioned into the dining room. The heavy oak table was polished to a high sheen. I arranged the linen napkins and set the crystal water goblets at 4 distinct positions. However, there were no porcelain dinner plates. There was no silverware. Instead, resting exactly in the center of each individual place setting was a thick, unmarked manila folder. I stood back and surveyed the arrangement. The juxtaposition of the fine crystal goblets against the stark clinical folders created a jarring visual tension. It was a physical manifestation of the impending conflict, the polite facade of a family dinner masking the brutal, documented reality of their crimes. At exactly 3:55, an engine rumbled in my driveway. I walked to the front window. Brad parked his oversized luxury vehicle near my garage. He stepped out first, wearing a dark sweater, his posture slightly more upright than it had been at the park. The illusion of impending wealth provides a temporary spine to desperate men. Patricia emerged next, wearing a tailored navy blazer and her signature pearls, her face arranged into an expression of gracious, forgiving maternity. Jessica exited the passenger side last. She was practically bouncing on her heels. She carried a gold foil bag resting in the crook of her arm. I opened the front door before they could ring the bell. Kaylee Patricia said, stepping onto the porch and offering a tight, obligatory embrace that felt entirely devoid of genuine affection. It smells wonderful. I am so glad we are finally handling this like adults. Brad offered a stiff nod, keeping his eyes averted as he stepped into the foyer. Jessica breezed past me, carrying the gold foil bag into the kitchen. She pulled out a bottle of cheap, mass-market champagne and set it triumphantly on the granite counter. "We brought something to celebrate," Jessica announced, her voice ringing with arrogant cheerfulness. My lawyer received an automated notification from the clinic portal on Friday afternoon. He told me the profiles were completely processed. "We know your kids are officially out, Kaylee. I appreciate you hosting this little surrender dinner. It is the mature thing to do. We can draft a settlement tonight and avoid the public embarrassment of a court order." She did not wait for an invitation. She walked directly into the dining room, fully expecting to see a table laden with food, ready to host the celebration of her newfound fortune. I followed her into the room, watching her survey the arrangement. Jessica stopped near the head of the table. Her eyes tracked over the crystal goblets and landed on the thick manila folders resting at every setting. The arrogant cheerfulness drained from her posture, replaced by a flash of profound irritation. She scoffed, letting out a sharp, theatrical sigh. She rolled her eyes toward the ceiling. Still with the dramatic paperwork, Kaylee Jessica complained, crossing her arms over her chest. "Are we seriously doing this? The lab already sent the notification. The science is settled. You do not need to hand out spreadsheets proving how much you spent on preschool tuition. We are taking the entire trust. The grandfather clause is absolute. Just serve the roast and let us sign the transfer documents." I did not respond to her petulant demands. I walked to the head of the oak table. I stood behind my designated chair. I placed my hands flat against the polished wood, anchoring my weight. I felt the steady, powerful rhythm of my own pulse. The adrenaline that usually accompanies conflict was entirely absent, replaced by a cold, exquisite clarity. "Sit down," I said. My voice was soft. It carried no anger, no panic, and no plea for understanding. It was a command, issued with the absolute authority of a person holding the winning hand. Patricia hesitated, glancing nervously at the stark folders. Brad swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the front door. Jessica remained standing, her jaw set in a stubborn, defiant line. I said, "Sit down." I repeated my tone, dropping a fraction lower, sharpening the edge of the instruction. "Greg will be joining us in a moment." The mention of the attorney shattered their assumption that this was a private, informal surrender. Patricia slowly lowered herself into the chair nearest the window. Brad slumped into the seat beside her. Jessica remained standing for a long, tense moment before finally sinking into her designated chair, glaring at the folder resting in front of her. The room fell completely silent. The savory scent of rosemary hung heavy in the air. Then the doorbell rang. A sharp, two-tone chime pierced the quiet house. It was the precise, predetermined signal indicating Greg Halloran had arrived. I looked down the length of the table. I looked at the mother who had stolen my father's pride, the sister who had attempted to erase my children, and the brother-in-law who was actively extorting our family legacy to cover his own failures. They were sitting exactly where I wanted them. The board was perfectly set. If you have ever absorbed a lifetime of quiet disrespect, if you have ever waited years to speak the unvarnished truth, you know the exquisite, terrifying power of this exact second. I turned away from the table and walked toward the foyer to open the door. The final act was officially beginning. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the heavy front door inward. Greg Halloran stood on the porch. He wore a dark charcoal suit, holding his slim leather briefcase at his side. We bypassed the standard societal pleasantries. He offered a single terse nod, stepping over the threshold. I closed the door behind him, the metal latch engaging with a definitive solid thud. We walked down the hallway together, our footsteps synchronizing on the hardwood floor, marching toward the impending confrontation. We crossed into the dining room. The atmosphere had thickened considerably during my brief absence. Patricia was picking nervously at a stray thread on her navy skirt. Brad was shifting his weight from side to side, his eyes darting toward the entryway. Jessica sat rigid, her chin tilted upward, projecting a hollow air of bored impatience. When Greg positioned himself beside my chair at the head of the oak table, the room fell entirely silent. The ambient hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen became the loudest sound in the house. The savory aroma of roasted beef and rosemary felt distinctly incongruous with the impending execution about to take place. I looked down the length of the table, making brief eye contact with each of my adversaries. "Jessica," I began. My voice emerged perfectly level. It carried the precise, detached tone of a forensic auditor delivering a quarterly risk assessment. "You hired Harrison Caldwell. You filed a formal petition with the probate court. You demanded the trust distributions adhere strictly to Richard Collins's biological descendants. You cited the century-old grandfather clause to insist my children hold no legal standing in this family. I reached down and placed my hand on the manila folder resting at my place setting. Please open the documents in front of you, I instructed. The sound of thick cardstock flipping open echoed around the room in uncoordinated succession. The first few pages contain the official findings from the court-appointed laboratory, I explained, maintaining a steady, unhurried cadence. The seals of authentication are located in the bottom right corners. Paragraph 3 contains the initial summary. It confirms Leo and Maya share 0 genetic markers with Richard. Jessica exhaled a breath she had clearly been holding for weeks. Her tense shoulders dropped. A smug, victorious smirk stretched across her face, illuminating her features with unchecked arrogance. She reached out, her manicured fingers grazing the neck of the cheap champagne bottle resting near her elbow. She felt vindicated. She believed the science had just validated her cruelty and handed her a vast fortune. However, Greg interjected smoothly. His gravelly baritone cut through the stagnant air, instantly arresting Jessica's movement. Her fingers hovered inches from the foil wrapper. "Please turn to page 4, Greg said. I watched my sister's hands. She grasped the corner of the thick paper and turned the page. Her eyes scanned the printed text. I observed the exact second her cognitive processing stalled. The smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of blank, profound confusion. Her brow furrowed deep into her forehead. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. She read the paragraph again, her eyes darting back and forth across the same line of clinical data, unable to reconcile the letters with her foundational worldview. I did not allow her the grace of a silent realization. I read the certified conclusion aloud, ensuring every person in the room heard the undeniable truth. Probability of biological relationship between Jessica Collins and Richard Collins, 0.0%. A sharp, ragged gasp erupted from the far side of the table. Patricia gripped the edge of the wood so tightly her knuckles blanched, the skin turning stark white against the dark oak. The polished veneer of her aristocratic persona shattered instantly. She stared at me, her eyes wide, with unadulterated terror. The secret she had guarded for 3 decades was suddenly lying under the harsh fluorescent lights of my dining room, exposed for everyone to examine. I reached into my own briefcase and extracted the vintage medical report securely housed inside its clear protective sleeve. I slid the yellowed parchment across the smooth table until it stopped directly in front of my sister. Dad contracted a severe viral infection. I stated, my voice echoing with rigid finality. The illness left him irreversibly sterile. That diagnosis was formalized 34 years ago, 3 years before you were born. He knew the truth long before you ever took your first breath. Jessica stared at the vintage letterhead. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow bursts. The champagne bottle sat ignored. She was finally comprehending the inescapable architecture of her own demise. You hired an expensive litigator to draft a ruthless mandate. I continued, letting the irony of her situation saturate the room. You forced a mandatory court-ordered genetic audit. You demanded the presiding judge adhere to a strict biological standard. By doing so, you legally proved you possess no rightful claim to his estate. You built a trap for my adopted children, and you marched yourself directly into the steel jaws. You just disinherited yourself. The reality of the situation crashed into Brad. The trust funds represented his singular escape route from catastrophic financial ruin. With Jessica legally disqualified from the inheritance, his impending bankruptcy was guaranteed. He shot up from his chair. The sudden, violent movement knocked his crystal water goblet over, sending a pool of clear liquid spilling across the polished oak veneer. "It is fake," Brad yelled. The veins in his neck strained against his shirt collar. He pointed a trembling finger at the medical record. "You fabricated that document. You paid off the clinic. This is a setup to steal her half of the money." He was sweating profusely. The overpowering scent of his strong cologne failed to mask the sharp tang of his panic. He was a cornered animal, lashing out at the hunter who had just closed the gate. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his volume. I simply retrieved the second stack of paperwork from my briefcase. I produced the forensic accounting spreadsheet, the pages highlighted in bright fluorescent yellow ink. I slid the compiled financial data down the table toward my mother. I audited the primary estate ledger I informed them. The room grew impossibly quiet, save for Brad's ragged breathing. Mom, you initiated 14 unauthorized wire transfers over the past 2 months. I detailed tracing the timeline with verbal precision. The destination was a limited liability company registered to Bradley Vance. The total sum was $65,000. I also pulled the public civil dockets. Brad is facing multiple mechanics liens and an active foreclosure notice. This was never a business bailout. I shifted my gaze toward Brad, dissecting his desperate, defensive posture. You discovered Patricia's secret affair, I said. You realized Jessica was illegitimate. You used that information to extort your mother-in-law, demanding hush money to keep your failing contracting business afloat. Patricia complied, draining liquid assets from a deceased man's accounts to protect her social standing. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. Extorting a family member is a civil matter, I explained. Draining $65,000 from an escrow account while acting as a temporary executor is felony embezzlement. It carries a mandatory prison sentence. I looked at Jessica, then at Patricia, and finally at Brad. Here are your options. I stated delivering the final, unyielding terms of their surrender. You will contact Harrison Caldwell first thing tomorrow morning. You will instruct him to formally withdraw the probate petition. You will waive all future claims to the Collins estate. If you refuse, or if you attempt to challenge the genetic findings, Greg will walk this forensic audit directly to the district attorney. You will trade your suburban foreclosure for a criminal indictment. They sat frozen in their chairs. The truth had systematically dismantled every lie, every scheme, and every hidden agenda they had brought into my home. They were boxed in. There was no remaining legal maneuver, no emotional plea, and no theatrical tantrum capable of altering the math. The undeniable facts rested on the table, holding them hostage to their own greed. They sat frozen in their chairs. The silence stretching across the dining room was dense and suffocating, interrupted only by the jagged, uneven rhythm of Brad struggling to draw breath. The undeniable facts rested on the mahogany surface, heavy and final. There was no remaining legal maneuver, no emotional plea, and no theatrical tantrum capable of altering the math. Brad moved first. He did not say a single word. He stood up, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the floorboards, and walked toward the foyer. He moved like a hollow shell of a man, his previous swagger entirely evaporated. Patricia followed him. Her posture had crumpled. The aristocratic, untouchable bearing she had cultivated for 3 decades vanished in an instant, replaced by the hunched, fragile frame of a woman caught in a devastating deception. She looked remarkably small, shrinking under the harsh fluorescent lights. Jessica remained in her designated chair for a moment longer. Her eyes stayed locked on the genetic probability report, staring at the zeros printed on the crisp white paper. She slowly reached out, closed the manila folder, and stood up. She left her tailored coat draped over the back of the chair. She left the cheap champagne resting unopened on the granite counter. The front door clicked shut. The engine of their leased luxury vehicle turned over the tires, crunching against the gravel driveway as they retreated from the battlefield they had built. The following morning arrived with crisp, efficient precision. At 8:15, Greg Halloran received a formal electronic transmission from Harrison Caldwell's office. The communication was brief, clinical, and stripped of all previous bluster. Caldwell formally withdrew the petition to invalidate the codicil. He also submitted a sworn waiver of all future claims regarding Richard Collins's estate on behalf of his client. Caldwell was a highly pragmatic litigator. He recognized a sinking ship when he saw the structural damage, and he had zero interest in tethering his professional reputation to a felony fraud case. 2 weeks later, Greg and I stood before the presiding probate judge in a quiet, wood-paneled courtroom. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for fiduciary abuse, reviewed the forensic accounting spreadsheet I had prepared. She examined the timeline of Patricia's erratic wire transfers, cross-referencing the dates with the public mechanic liens and the suburban foreclosure notices. The paper trail of extortion and theft was undeniable. Disgusted by the gross mismanagement of the primary ledger, the judge delivered a swift and punishing ruling. She formally stripped Patricia of her temporary executor status. She granted me full, unrestricted administrative control over the entire estate. The judge then addressed the final distribution of the trust funds. My father's original codicil explicitly named me, Jessica Leo, and Maya as equal beneficiaries. However, Jessica had formally introduced the grandfather clause into the permanent court record, aggressively demanding strict adherence to the true bloodline. The judge chose to honor her specific request. Utilizing Jessica's exact legal phrasing, the judge ruled that because Jessica lacked the requisite genetic markers to qualify as a biological issue, her ties to the ancestral trust were permanently severed. She had demanded the sword of genetic purity, and the court allowed that exact blade to swing directly back toward her. Her own arrogant petition became the instrument of her financial undoing. I secured my rightful share of the funds, and I established ironclad, protected educational accounts for Leo and Maya. Actions dictate consequences, and the subsequent 6 months allowed the severe financial realities to fully materialize. Without the steady influx of stolen estate liquidity, Brad's contracting business collapsed entirely. The unpaid supplier liens suffocated his operating budget, forcing him to dissolve the limited liability company. The National Bank finalized the foreclosure on their sprawling suburban property. I drove past their neighborhood once during a routine errand. I observed a generic rented moving truck parked in their driveway, hauling away the remnants of a lifestyle they could no longer afford to fake. The manicured lawn was overgrown, the pristine facade crumbling in real time. Patricia faced her own quiet ruin. The threat of a criminal embezzlement indictment hung over her head, contingent upon her strict compliance and total silence. Stripped of the $65,000 she had siphoned and permanently cut off from the primary estate, she could no longer maintain her country club memberships or fund her luxury wellness retreats. The elite social circles she had prioritized over her own husband quickly discarded her when the whispers of her financial misconduct began to circulate. She sold her large house and relocated to a small, isolated apartment on the outskirts of the city. The weaponized, honeyed sweetness evaporated from her voice, replaced by the profound, hollow shame of a woman who had gambled her legacy on a lie and lost everything. We do not speak anymore, and the silence is a welcome relief. The afternoon I finalized the probate distributions, I visited the safety deposit box at the downtown bank. I retrieved my father's vintage 1978 Rolex. The silver bezel remained scratched. The glass face still bore the tiny chip near the 6 o'clock mark. I brought it home, unhooking the metal clasp. I did not place the timepiece in a glass display case or lock it away in a safe. I walked into the living room, knelt down to eye level with Leo, and placed the heavy watch into his small hands. I told him it belonged to his grandfather, a man who loved him enough to build a fortress around his future. Leo traced the scratched metal with his thumb, smiling at the rhythmic ticking of the hands. The watch was right where it belonged, resting in the care of a true descendant. I never raised my voice. I never posted a single defensive paragraph on social media. I never stood in a public park and demanded an audience for my grief. I merely audited the ledgers, read the fine print, and allowed their own desperate greed to trigger the trap my father had so carefully engineered. Today, it is a warm Sunday afternoon. I am sitting on the wooden steps of my front porch, holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. A light autumn breeze rustles the oak leaves, sending them drifting across the pavement. I am watching Leo and Maya chase each other across the green lawn, their laughter echoing through the quiet neighborhood. They are safe. Their foundation is secure. The truth is a quiet, devastating instrument. The law does not care about your feelings, your manufactured victimhood, or your theatrical demands. Documents do not play favorites, and forensic accounting does not lie. If you ever find yourself surrounded by people who mistake your patience for surrender, remember this story. Being the quiet one does not mean you are weak. It means you are taking notes. See you next time.